New Zealand, also known as Aotearoa, is one of the safest and cleanest countries in the world. I would know, I've lived here almost my whole life. Its relatively quiet and impressive beautiful landscape makes it a bucket list destination for overseas travellers. However, the small country does have its fair share of high-profile crimes recorded throughout its history. From an unsolved family murder in the 1970s to an international espionage attack on New Zealand citizens. Today, we are going to be diving into the 10 most significant crimes of New Zealand. Welcome back to Shadow Matter. If you're new to the channel, then hi, hello, kia ora. Why don't you join me in the shadows here every second Sunday, where I take a look at a darker side of our world with a focus on stories and cases from Australia and New Zealand. If you prefer to listen rather than watch, then why don't you hop on over to my podcast? Search Shadow Matter on Spotify. Today's episode is the 10 most significant crimes to happen in New Zealand. The pristine land at the bottom of the world also carries a colloquial nickname of God Zone, referring to the archipelago nation as a place favoured by God. Though it's considered one of the safest countries in the world to travel and live in, it's also home to some pretty horrible crimes, beginning in 1840 with the first execution recorded by British settlers. There are honestly so many crimes that I didn't even realise, so I will be making another video on this, perhaps like a chronological timeline of crimes or something of that nature. So without further ado, let's explore the 10 most significant crimes in New Zealand. Number 10. The hanging of Maketu. In 1842, the first recorded execution in New Zealand took place in Auckland, and there's a lot to unpack here, so I'll try my best to give it some context. On the 7th of March 1842, 17-year-old Maketu Wharetotura, the son of a prominent Maori chief, was hanged in front of an audience of up to 1,000 people at the busy intersection of Queen Street and Victoria Street West. Now, 5 days earlier, Maketu was convicted of murdering 5 British settlers on Motuarohia Island in the Bay of Islands, also known as Roberton Island. The murders were committed in a time of unstable relationships between the Maori people and the British settlers, and can be looked at as a wider extent of the effects of the recently signed Treaty of Waitangi, just 2 years prior. Maketu Wharetotura was hired by a widow, Elizabeth Roberton, to be a farmhand on the island. He was also frequently mistreated and verbally abused by his boss, a man by the name of Thomas Bull. After a pay dispute, Maketu took matters into his own hands and murdered Thomas Bull with an axe while he slept. The young man then murdered Elizabeth and her children. The last child made a run for it, but was caught by Maketu and thrown over a cliff. This case caused a lot of controversy, and it's important to note that after the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi, the British Crown, who governed New Zealand's minority population of settlers, did not exactly have any rights to make any judicial convictions or hand out any punishments to the majority of Maori population. As stated in the Treaty of Waitangi, both sides agreed that Maori would handle their own affairs, but they would be considered British citizens. However, this case involves both races, and now it's a matter to be considered by both parties as what to do with this Maori offender. Maketu hid in his father's village, but was handed over by Maori, who considered this apprehension a utu, or repayment. They thought this murder was a lowly act of cowardice to murder young children and wanted nothing to do with Maketu, who was subsequently banished from the tribe and area. Maketu was convicted of the 5 murders and sentenced to hanging, which, as stated before, was the first judicial execution recorded in New Zealand's history. Number 9. The arrest of Maori prophet Rua Kenana. Rua Kenana, Tuhoi prophet from the Urewera. If you know, you know. On Sunday, the 2nd of April 1916, 57 police raided the Ngaituhoi settlement of Maungapohatu in the Urewera Ranges. Their mission was to apprehend the self-proclaimed leader of the Ringatu Church, Rua Kenana, earlier founded by Te Kuti. Rua Kenana hailed from the Ngaituhoi tribe in the Urewera Ranges, and many of the Tuhoi communities saw Rua as a symbol of a new era in which their lost lands would be returned and kept in their name. In 1907, he built a new religious community at the foot of Maungapohatu, the mountain that is sacred to Tuhoi. Rua originally sold 40,000 acres of Tūhoe land for today's equivalent of $5 million. Rua used the money to develop his community at Maungapuhatu. He also hoped that roads and railways would make it economically viable. None of this happened, however. People in the settlement continued to die because of harsh winters, poor diet, and poor housing. By 1913, Rua's community had declined from 600 people to about 30 families. In 1916, at the height of World War I, Rua publicly opposed the idea of Māori conscription into the military, and this did not sit well with the New Zealand government. The government accused Rua of sedition and began harassing Rua. On one occasion, he was arrested for selling illicit liquor. However, Rua resisted arrest and dismissed his trial by failing to turn up to court. The New Zealand government wanted to set an example, so they sent a large force of 57 heavily armed constables to arrest him in Maungapuhatu on April 2, 1916. This resulted in a gunfight in which Rua's son and another Māori man were killed in the exchange of bullets. Rua was arrested along with others and stood trial in Auckland Supreme Court, and it was one of the longest lasting trials in New Zealand's history. His charges varied from sedition to selling illicit alcohol and treason, but he was ultimately found guilty of resisting arrest and was sentenced to 12 months hard labour and 18 months imprisonment. Rua Kenana was released from jail in April 1918, but the Maungapuhatu community has never recovered. Number 8. The disappearance of Mona Blades. 18-year-old Mona Blades was last seen on the 31st of May sitting in the back seat of an orange Datsun station wagon. Her body was never found and her disappearance has never been explained. Mona was living in Hamilton with her sister Lillian, brother-in-law Tom, and baby niece Angela. It was Queen's birthday weekend and she decided to hitchhike to her family home in Hastings as a surprise visit for her nephew's first birthday. She had a present for him, a set of colourful plastic tumblers. Tom dropped Mona off on Cambridge Road, State Highway 1, early on Saturday the 31st of May. She was seen getting into the orange Datsun at about 10 a.m. Later that morning, a fencing contractor spotted the car parked about 200 metres down Matea Road, a dirt road off the Napier-Taupo Highway. He saw a woman fitting Mona's description in the back and a middle-aged man in the driver's seat. When the contractor drove past again a short time later, the car was empty. Hundreds of police from Taupo, Rotorua, Hamilton and Auckland combed the 200 kilometres of highway between Tokoroa and Napier. Some persons of interest were identified, but there was not enough evidence for anyone to be prosecuted. Perhaps because abduction/murder crimes are relatively rare in New Zealand, Mona's disappearance still has a high profile as one of the country's longest unsolved murders. In 2004, police began a major review of the case. It was hoped that Mona Blades Hotline and a TVNZ documentary might prompt someone to come forward with crucial new information. The reinvestigation was wound down in 2006, but like all unsolved murders, the case remains open, and from time to time, the police will follow up on tips from members of the public, but it ultimately remains unsolved. Number 7. The murder of Sophie Elliott. On January the 9th, 2008, 22-year-old Otago University student Sophie Elliott was murdered by her ex-boyfriend, Clayton Weatherston, who stabbed her 216 times with a knife and a pair of scissors. This case attracted a massive amount of media coverage and resulted in a law change in New Zealand. Sophie was living and studying in Dunedin when she began a relationship with her university lecturer, Clayton Weatherston. The relationship was described as troubled by those who knew them, and it lasted about 6 months when it ended shortly before her death. Sophie Elliott was at her family home with her mother Leslie on January the 9th, 2008. She was packing up boxes for her move to Wellington to start a new job. At around 12:30 p.m, Sophie's ex-boyfriend Clayton Weatherston arrived unannounced, stating that he had a farewell gift for her. A short time later, Leslie heard her daughter screaming. A New Zealand police officer responding to the 111 call from Leslie found Weatherston locked inside Sophie's bedroom. When asked what he had done, he told the officer, quote, "I killed her." He was then arrested and taken into custody. An autopsy revealed that Sophie died from the result of 216 stab wounds. Weatherston was found with a knife that he regularly carried in his laptop bag and a pair of scissors. Additionally, there were 7 blunt force injuries. The pathologist found some defensive wounds and that the attack targeted aspects of beauty and was intended to disfigure her. Weatherston was charged with the murder, and his 5-week-long trial gained a lot of media attention. There was public outrage at Weatherston's claim that he had been provoked, led to the abolition of provocation as a partial defense against a charge of murder. Sophie Elliott's legacy is now remembered by a foundation named after her that aims to warn and educate young women about the signs of an abusive relationship. Number 6. The Crew Murders. In 1970, Waikato couple Harvey and Jeanette Crew were violently murdered and their bodies were dumped into the Waikato River. This case gained a lot of interest from the media and public, and while a conviction was made, the police were found to have planted evidence and the murders remain unsolved. After a few days of neighbours trying to call the Crew residents, Jeanette's father was asked by a neighbour to check in on the family. When he arrived, he found his 2-year-old granddaughter, Rochelle, the only person inside the home. She was inconsolable and a little malnourished, but otherwise appeared in good health. His attention was then drawn to the lounge, where he came across a series of dried bloodstains. Something had gone terribly wrong. The Crews were initially reported as missing, but after 3 months, their bodies were found in the Waikato River, tied and weighted down with various items. What motive could the killer have for murdering the Crews? A feud? An affair? Public and media attention surrounded the case, and everyone had their opinions when the police turned their focus onto the Crews' neighbour, Arthur Allen Thomas. Thomas farmed nearby and was twice convicted of double murder, but doubts remained about the police methods and evidence. It was later found that police had planted evidence at the crime scene to frame Thomas. After a long campaign, he was pardoned and awarded almost $1 million, equivalent to $6.5 million in 2025, in compensation in 1979. However, it is still not known who was responsible for the Crew murders, and the case remains unsolved. Number 5. The murder of Ben Smart and Olivia Hope. Possibly the most debated case in New Zealand is the highly prolific Sounds Murders, also known as the murders of Ben Smart and Olivia Hope. On New Year's Eve 1997, Marlborough friends Ben Smart and Olivia Hope attended a New Year's Eve party at a popular resort in the Marlborough Sounds. By New Year's Day, the two friends had disappeared. A massive police investigation was undertaken, and many witnesses stated they got onto a 2-masted blue and white ketch with a scruffy-looking male. Media outlets swarmed around Marlborough shortly after the story broke, and despite any leads as to the whereabouts of the two youngsters, the case was handed over to an experienced Christchurch detective, Rob Pope, and ultimately upgraded to homicide. The case gripped the nation and was the main headline for almost 2 years, especially after police turned their attention to local boat builder by the name of Scott Watson. Scott Watson was also at the party, but his boat and profile did not match the description of eyewitnesses. Regardless, Watson was later arrested after a lengthy investigation and was charged with double homicide, despite the lack of bodies, and sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 17 years. Watson has always maintained his innocence and has many supporters who believe the case was a miscarriage of justice. To this date, the bodies of Ben and Olivia have never been found. I do have a full-length documentary-style video about the case, so if you want to see that and learn more, I will leave a link in the description below. Number 4. The Bain Family Murders. Another high-profile case. It was honestly almost a tie between this and the Sounds Murders. The Bain family murders have divided New Zealanders for over 3 decades over the outcome of the 2 subsequent trials. In June of 1994, 22-year-old David Cullen Bain of Dunedin, New Zealand, made a call to emergency services in which he stated that, quote, "they are all dead," and told police to hurry. When police arrived at the Bain family residence, they came across 5 bodies who had been shot dead, later confirmed to be Bain's immediate family: Robin, 58, his wife Margaret, 50, their daughter Arawa, 19, and Laniette, 18, and their son Stephen, 14. Bain stated that he came home after a morning paper run and that he found his family dead. A message was found typed on a computer that said, "Sorry, you are the only one who deserved to stay." The gun that was used in the murder was lying next to the body of Bain's father, Robin. The youngest family member, Stephen, had obvious signs of struggle and was thought to have put up a fight with his killer. When brought in for a statement, police noticed and documented what appeared to be bruises and cuts on David Bain's body, some of which David could not explain how he got them. Under police suspicion, David Bain was later arrested for the murders and convicted after a 3-week trial in which he was found guilty of 5 counts of murder. It should be noted that the defense argued it was the father who murdered the family and then shot himself. The Crown argued it was David who committed the murders. Both sides failed to prove a motive for the slayings. Bain then spent 13 years in prison while garnering support from those who believed in his innocence, most notably former rugby player for the All Blacks, Joe Karam. In 2007, David's legal team and Karam went before London's Privy Council to get Bain's convictions quashed, in which they were successful. In 2009, after 13 years, Bain's case was retried, and after a lengthy 3 months, he was found not guilty. The defense argued that Robin Bain committed the murders to hide evidence of a relationship with his teenage daughter. However, many doubts have always surfaced about who actually committed the murders. Bain was, after all, the only survivor of the tragedy and had multiple cuts and bruises that could indicate he had struggled with the youngest victim. Bloody footprints found by police using luminol that could have been used to clearly indicate who the killer was, although evidence of this was lost when the Bain house was burnt down 2 weeks after the murders by external family members. A broken pair of spectacles were found in David's room, and a missing spectacle lens was found in Stephen's room. Police also noticed that he was wearing blood-stained socks when they arrived. This could have indicated he walked about the house and accidentally stood in blood without realizing what had taken place, or it could indicate that he was in fact the killer and walked room to room, murdering his family while donning the socks. The murder weapon was also stored in David's room, in his wardrobe, along with thousands of rounds of ammunition. There are many more facts about this case, and while it may be controversial, it is also not without warrant to some. This case remains a mystery, and that is who did it, Robin Bain or David Bain. Number 3. The Aramoana Massacre. The small seaside township of Aramoana near Dunedin was the scene of what was then the deadliest mass murder in New Zealand history. On the 13th of November 1990, 33-year-old unemployed man David Malcolm Gray went on a 22-and-a-half-hour shooting rampage in the small Otago township of Aramoana. The massacre began after David Gray had an altercation with his neighbour regarding one of his daughters wandering onto his property. Gray went inside his home and then came back out with a semi-automatic rifle and began firing at his neighbour. Gray then walked inside his neighbour's home and shot 3 young girls before setting the house alight. The carnage continued for another 22 hours, which saw 13 people fatally wounded and another 3 injured. The first responder on the scene was Sergeant Stuart Guthrie, an officer in charge of Port Chalmers Police Station, and an NCO in the Armed Defenders Squad. He was shot in the head by Gray after Guthrie believed the offender was surrendering. The Anti-Terrorist Squad, ATS, now known as the Special Tactics Group, STG, arrived in Aramoana at 6 a.m. the next morning and began the search of Gray, who by now was hiding in a nearby crib. After a long day of searching house to house, the ATS found Gray in the crib and engaged with gunfire. Gray fled the house, shooting from the hip, yelling, "Kill me." He was shot several times before he succumbed to his wounds. The horrific ordeal lasted 22 hours and resulted in 14 people dead, including Gray. A number of people involved in the incident received bravery awards, including Guthrie, who was posthumously awarded the George Cross for gallantry. Even today, Aramoana is still haunted by the massacre, and its effects will be felt for a long time. There is a really good book and film about the attack called Out of the Blue. I highly recommend both if you haven't read or watched them. Number 2, the bombing of the Rainbow Warrior. Bizarre and kind of scary are the only 2 words that come across my mind when I think about this next case. On the 10th of July 1985, the Greenpeace protest ship Rainbow Warrior docked in Auckland and was torn apart by 2 bombs planted by French Secret Service agents. 40 years ago this year, the flagship vessel for the international environmental organisation Greenpeace was docked in Auckland's Marsden Wharf after it had recently returned from French Polynesia, in which it was used to protest nuclear testing in the area. Just before midnight on the 10th of July 1985, the two explosions rocked the harbour, sinking the 40-metre Rainbow Warrior. Underwater charges had been placed by the Frenchmen on her hull, blowing 2 holes in the ship. The Rainbow Warrior sank almost immediately. The crew managed to escape apart from photographer Fernando Pereira, who drowned. Initially, police believed it was an accident caused by the protesters, thinking they had done something wrong. However, it was determined that 2 limpet mines were used, placed on the outside of the hull and the other attached to the propeller shaft. On the night of the explosions, a man was seen wearing scuba diving gear in an inflatable dinghy. After coming ashore and tying up the dinghy, he drove away in a van. Members of a local boating club became suspicious and took note of the registration number of the vehicle. The police were able to trace the van through a hire firm to a Swiss couple using the name Turange. Within 30 hours of the bombing, the Turanges were interviewed by the police and then charged. In the meantime, forestry workers had reported a suspicious meeting between occupants of the van and the station wagon, which was later linked to a charter yacht, the Uvea. Warrants were issued for the crew of the yacht, which had been used to bring the explosives and other equipment into New Zealand, but no trace of the yacht or crew could be found. A month after the bombing, it was revealed that the 2 rangers were Dominique Prieur and Alain Maffart, agents of the French Secret Service, the DSGE. Police later discovered that up to 11 French agents had entered New Zealand as part of the Rainbow Warrior operation. A French report came out admitting that French agents had been in New Zealand, but denied they had carried out the bombing. This report resulted in so much outcry that the French Prime Minister admitted that French agents had been responsible. He claimed that because they were members of the military and had acted under orders, they could not be held responsible for their actions. On the 4th of November 1985, Maffart and Prieur appeared in an Auckland court where they pleaded guilty to the charges of manslaughter and willful damage and were sentenced to 10 years imprisonment. But it doesn't end there. Pressure was put on New Zealand by the French government, including threats to impose sanctions against New Zealand produce. The United Nations Secretary-General agreed to mediate between the 2 countries and decided that Maffart and Prieur should be removed to Hao Atoll in French Polynesia to stay there for the next 3 years. France was to apologise to New Zealand and pay $13 million in compensation. Greenpeace used the reparations paid by the French government for a new Rainbow Warrior. After renewed pressure from France, including threats to work against New Zealand trade access to the European Economic Community, the 2 agents left Hao Atoll before the 3 years was up and returned to France. In 2015, former DGSE agent Jean-Luc Kester, who was one of the French agents who placed the explosives on the ship's hull, apologised in a media interview. A couple of years later, a further agent, Christine Cabon, was tracked down by reporters and also gave an interview. The Rainbow Warrior was refloated but could not be repaired. It was later scuttled at the Cavalli Islands off the northern coast to become an artificial reef for marine life. Number 1. The Christchurch mosque attacks. In recent memory, no other event has had more of an effect on New Zealand society than the 2019 Christchurch mosque attacks. On the 15th of March 2019, 2 consecutive mass shootings took place at the Al Noor Mosque and the Linwood Islamic Centre in Christchurch. The crime was committed by a single perpetrator during Friday prayer at 1:40 p.m. and the other shortly afterwards at 1:52 p.m. The attacks took the lives of 51 innocent people and another 89 were wounded. The gunman was later apprehended by police when they rammed his car as he was trying to drive to a third mosque in Ashburton. This crime was the worst single terror attack on New Zealand soil and was the first far-right terror attack to be successfully live-streamed. The shooter was fueled by far-right white supremacist ideologies, and I would mention his name, but honestly, I don't want to give him any kind of attention on my channel. If you want to learn more, I will link the sources I've used to research in the description below. He pleaded guilty to 51 murders, 40 attempted murders and engaging in a terrorist act, and in August 2020, he was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, the first such sentence in New Zealand. The attacks were planned at least 3 months before, using drones to scout the grounds of the mosques, and he also obtained floor plans online. The New Zealand government, led by then Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, condemned the act as a hate crime, calling it one of New Zealand's darkest days, and comforted the public with inspirational messages and showing solidarity with the Muslim community. For a bit of context, I remember being at work when someone on my Facebook timeline shared a video of what I thought was like a screen cap of someone playing a first-person shooter game. And then I realized it was real. For the next few weeks and months after, I remember people being really on edge, and I used to take a walk at night after work for a bit of exercise, and felt completely safe to do so. This crime changed that. I no longer felt that safe and stopped my night walks. New Zealand no longer felt safe anymore. The country has joined the unfortunate ranks of many other countries around the world that have suffered from the acts of cowards who want nothing more than to strike hate and terror into our lives. The attacks also brought about changes to New Zealand's gun laws and banned semi-automatic and military-style weapons. All legally obtained semi-automatic and military-grade firearms and their relevant ammunition were able to be handed over to police in a buyback scheme. The scheme was initiated in July and lasted 6 months. Provisional data from police show that as of 21st of December 2019, a total of 33,000 hand-ins had been completed and 56,000 firearms had been collected. And that is today's episode, the 10 most significant crimes in New Zealand. What are your thoughts? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to check out my podcast on Spotify, and if you want to support this channel, then consider becoming a member and join Beyond the Shadows for exclusive bonus videos. And as always, if you like this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, subscribe if you want to see more videos like this, and click that notifications bell to keep up to date with the latest videos. And together, we can explore the strange, the terrifying, the unknown, the shadow matter.